All right, buckle up everyone, because today we're diving deep into a world that might surprise you, a world of unconventional desires.
Unconventional. Definitely a topic that sparks a lot of curiosity.
Absolutely. And, we've received a ton of YouTube videos and articles from all of you about this. And I have to admit, even I'm learning so much already just going through it all.
Oh, yeah. It's a fascinating area for sure. And I think, often really misunderstood.
For sure. So our mission today is to unpack what these desires actually are and like why they're so appealing to some folks and maybe, even challenge those societal assumptions that we've built around them. We've got input from sex therapists, researchers, and even individuals who identify with these interests. So it's going to be like a really diverse conversation.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating is that research is starting to show that a lot of these so-called taboo fantasies are actually way more common than we might think.
Oh, really? Now you've got me intrigued. Tell me more. What kind of fantasies are we talking about here?
Well, for example, Dr. Joyle, he highlights a study that found that 2/3 of women have had rape fantasies. I know that might sound shocking at first, but it's super important to remember that, fantasy and real-life desires, they're totally separate things.
Totally. It's all in the realm of imagination. But what does this actually mean for our listeners? I'm guessing it means that having fantasies that are outside the norm doesn't make you weird or deviant.
Exactly. Dr. Joyle even suggests that embracing our fantasies, no matter what they are, can actually lead to a more fulfilling sex life overall.
Interesting. So are we kind of moving away from this black and white normal versus abnormal when it comes to desire?
It seems like it, yeah. There's a growing understanding that sexuality is more like a spectrum. You've probably heard of the term kink spectrum. It embraces this whole diversity of desires.
Okay, this is where it gets juicy, folks. This researcher, Ayala, she did this massive survey on kinks and fetishes with over 700,000 respondents. Huge. And get this, she mapped out 10 clusters of kinks. Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more. What are these clusters?
Absolutely. Ayala's work really shines a light on the vast landscape of human desire. These clusters, they cover everything from power dynamics, like you see in bondage or spanking, to voyeurism and exhibitionism, which is all about the thrill of watching or being watched.
Right. Makes sense. What else?
Okay, well, there's degradation, which may involve things like messy play or humiliation and age play, where adults explore fantasies related to being a baby or, diaper wearing, stuff like that.
Wow, quite a variety. Any other clusters that stand out to you?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We've got animalistic interests, like furries who are attracted to anthropomorphic animals. There's clusters around extreme femininity and masculinity, gender play, like pegging or sissification, and even, get this, horror-themed kinks. Things like blood or zombies.
Zombies. Okay, that's a new one. What about desires that are considered even more taboo? Those related to disgust or even incest. Are those on the spectrum too?
Yes, they're included as well. Ayala's research takes in the full spectrum, even those categories that might make people uncomfortable.
So with all these different kinks out there, the big question is, why? Why are people drawn to these things? Especially when some seem to go against our basic survival instincts. What are the experts saying about that?
Right. That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Researchers are exploring all sorts of theories. For instance, Dr. Joyle suggests that our fundamental sexual interests, including our fantasies, they might actually start developing during childhood.
Wait, are we talking about childhood trauma leading to kinks? Because that seems like a bit of a jump.
Not necessarily. Dr. Joyle is very clear that these interests aren't caused by trauma, although they might, coincidentally echo those experiences in some cases. He uses this interesting example about people who are into bondage and how some were really fascinated by Tintin comics as kids.
Tintin the Reporter. I loved those as a kid.
Exactly. And remember how Tintin was always getting tied up? Well, Dr. Joyle found that some folks who are now into bondage remember feeling kind of excited by those scenes even before they understood the whole sexual aspect of it.
Huh. That's really interesting. So it's like these interests might already be there in some form during childhood. What else are researchers saying about how they develop?
Well, this brings us to that classic debate of nature versus nurture, right? It applies to kinks just like anything else. A good example is foot fetishes. We have this neuroscientist, Ramachandran, who came up with a theory based on brain mapping.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the link to foot fetishes?
So Ramachandran noticed that the areas in the brain for foot sensation and for genital sensation, they're actually really close to each other. His theory is that this proximity could lead to a sort of like cross-wiring.
Oh, interesting. So maybe in people with foot fetishes, the signals for those areas get mixed up.
Yeah, that's the general idea. However, even Ramachandran acknowledges that this theory has its limits. For example, it might explain why someone enjoys having their feet touched, but not necessarily why they're specifically attracted to, like, other people's feet.
I see. It addresses the sensation, but not the attraction. And what about all the other fetishes out there that don't have this neat brain mapping explanation?
Right. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all answer. And Ella brings up this really important point about misattributing causality when it comes to kinks. Even if someone had like a seemingly formative experience involving feet when they were younger, that might not be the sole reason for their foot fetish as an adult. There could be like an underlying predisposition at play, whether it's genetic or something else entirely.
So it's more like a complex mix of things, not just one simple answer.
Exactly. Super multifaceted. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the actual experience of having a foot fetish. We all know the stereotype, the creepy guy, obsessed with feet. How accurate is that?
Yeah, that stereotype definitely exists, but I'm guessing there's more to the story. What are our sources saying?
Well, we have a great resource to help us with this. Tina Horn.
Who's Tina Horn, and why is her perspective so valuable here?
Tina's a woman with a foot fetish, and she's super open about her experience. What's really interesting is that she emphasizes the diversity of experiences even within one specific fetish.
So it's not just one monolithic foot fetish.
Yeah.
There are different ways people experience it. Tell me more.
Totally. For Tina, it's about connecting with the whole person. She says that feet have so much to say about who they are.
Yeah.
And she finds pleasure in the sensory experience of touching, smelling, even tasting them. It's about intimacy and connection for her.
Wow, that's a totally different perspective than that stereotypical sneaky foot pick image. Why do you think that stereotype is so pervasive?
Well, both Tina and Dr. Lehmiller, they talk about how these assumptions often stem from the way mental health institutions historically pathologized anything that was outside the so-called norm.
So basically, if you weren't into completely vanilla missionary position sex, purely for procreation, you were considered deviant or mentally ill.
Pretty much. And unfortunately, that kind of thinking has left a lasting stigma around fetishes, making people hesitant to talk about them openly.
Which, of course, just makes the creepiness factor worse, right? If you can't talk about something openly and honestly, it's bound to be shrouded in secrecy and shame. And that makes it harder for people to explore and understand their desires in a healthy way, especially in relationships.
Exactly. Open communication is key.
So let's talk about relationships. What happens when you have one partner who's like super into latex and the other one, well, just isn't? How do couples deal with those differences?
Dr. Lehmiller has some really solid advice for couples dealing with what he calls mismatched kinks. First, he says it's important to distinguish between requirement kinks and enhancer kinks.
Okay, I'm curious now. What's the difference?
A requirement kink is something that's absolutely essential for someone to be sexually fulfilled. They literally can't, get off without it. An enhancer kink, on the other hand, is something that adds to the experience, but it's not a deal breaker.
So, for example, some people might really enjoy spanking, but they can still have a great sex life without it, while others might absolutely need it to be truly satisfied.
Exactly. Understanding this difference can help couples figure out how to move forward. Dr. Lehmiller suggests a few options, like open relationships, where partners can explore their individual kinks with other consenting adults.
Oh la la.
Yeah.
That's one way to go.
Yeah.
But I imagine those can get kind of messy, right?
For sure. Open relationships need a ton of communication, trust, and clear boundaries to work well. And they're definitely not for everyone.
What are some other options for couples with these mismatched kinks? Are there ways to find some common ground within the relationship itself?
Well, partners can also choose to focus on fulfilling their individual needs through, things like fantasy or masturbation. It can be a healthy way to release that tension without putting extra pressure on the relationship.
Makes sense. But what if none of that works? What if the kink incompatibility is just like too big of a hurdle?
Honestly, sometimes if both partners value a fulfilling sex life, a breakup might be the healthiest option in the long run.
Ooh, that's tough. But I guess it's better to part ways than to stay in a relationship that's just sexually frustrating for both people.
I agree. It's not about judging anyone's kinks. It's about recognizing compatibility and respecting each other's needs.
So where does this leave us? What have we learned from this deep dive into unconventional desires so far?
I think we've learned quite a bit, actually. We've seen that what we consider taboo can vary so widely and often has more to do with societal norms than anything inherently wrong. We've touched on the possible origins of kinks, acknowledging how complex the whole nature versus nurture thing is. And we've even started tackling how to navigate these desires within relationships.
Wow, you're right. We have covered a lot of ground. What about you, listeners? Are you starting to see things a bit differently now?
One thing I really want to stress is the importance of consent, communication, and respect in any sexual activity. This is especially important when we're talking about exploring kinks.
Couldn't agree more. And I think we can all learn from Tina Horn's perspective when she says, and I love this quote, "There's no accounting for taste. I hope that people will learn to see someone who likes feet as just someone who has a taste for feet."
It's such a simple but powerful message about acceptance and recognizing the diversity of human desire.
And that wraps up part 1 of our deep dive into the world of unconventional desires. We've explored the kink spectrum, we've delved into some of the psychology behind these interests, and we've even touched on how to navigate them in relationships.
Hopefully, this has given you a new way of looking at these often misunderstood aspects of human sexuality.
Absolutely. Maybe it's even sparked some curiosity about your own desires and fantasies. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue exploring this fascinating topic.
You know, it's interesting when you think about how that pathologization of unconventional desires, how that's actually impacted our understanding of these interests.
Yeah, totally. We were just talking about how anything outside that so-called norm was considered deviant or even like mentally ill. But what does that actually mean, practically speaking? How did that play out in the past?
Well, I mean, think about it. Homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder in the DSM until like the 1970s. And a lot of people with unconventional sexual interests faced, social stigma, discrimination, and even things like aversion therapies that were meant to cure them. It's crazy.
It's wild to think about that now, especially with all the progress we've made with LGBTQ plus rights and acceptance. But it makes you wonder, are there still lingering effects from that historical pathologization? Does it still color how we view these unconventional desires today?
Absolutely. Those historical attitudes definitely still have an impact. People might still feel ashamed or even afraid to express their true desires, even to their partners. And this fear of judgment, it can lead to secrecy, isolation, and even some unhealthy coping mechanisms.
That makes total sense. So if we want to move towards more understanding and acceptance, where do we even start?
Well, I think education is a huge part of it, right? Learning about the diversity of human sexuality, understanding that spectrum of desires, and really challenging those outdated stereotypes, that's all super important.
Yeah, knowledge is power for sure. But what about on a more personal level? Let's say someone's listening to this and they're realizing, hey, maybe I have some of these unconventional desires myself. What advice would you give them?
I think the first thing is to be kind to yourself. There's nothing wrong with having these desires. Explore them, learn about them, and find ways to express them safely and consensually. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are tons of people out there who share those same interests.
I love that message. Acceptance, exploration, community, it's so important. But let's be real, not everyone's going to be on board with this whole kink spectrum idea, right?
Right.
Some people might still think these desires are weird or creepy, no matter how much we try to educate them.
That's true, you're right. Not everyone will be receptive, and that's where boundaries come in. You don't have to share your desires with anyone who makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe.
So true. Protecting your own well-being is crucial. But what about navigating these desires in relationships? We talked a bit about Dr. Limmeller's advice on, mismatched kinks earlier. Are there any other strategies couples can use to kind of bridge those gaps?
Communication, as always, is key. Open and honest conversations about desires, boundaries, and comfort levels, that's essential. Couples can explore different things together, like reading erotic literature, watching educational videos, or even attending workshops on kink and BDSM. The goal is to find something that works for both partners.
That makes sense. It's about finding that sweet spot where both partners feel respected, safe, and fulfilled.
Right, exactly. And, sometimes even with the best communication, the best effort, couples might realize that their desires are just too different to reconcile. And that's okay, too.
It's true. It's important to acknowledge that not all relationships are meant to be. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for both yourself and your partner is to let go.
Definitely. I agree with that. But even in those situations, I think there's a valuable lesson to be learned about self-awareness, acceptance, and respecting the diversity of human desire.
Okay, so we've talked about education, communication, boundaries. Those are all so important. Is there anything else we can do to really challenge the stigma around these unconventional desires and create a more accepting society as a whole?
I think representation is huge, Seeing positive portrayals of people with diverse sexual interests in media, in literature, in art, it can really help normalize these desires and break down those harmful stereotypes.
You're right. When we see ourselves reflected in the stories we consume, it validates our experiences and makes us feel less alone.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to support those creators and platforms that are really pushing for more inclusivity and representation in this area.
Absolutely. We need to lift up those voices and celebrate the beauty of human diversity in all its forms.
You know, as we've been having this conversation, I keep thinking back to that quote from Tina Horn. There's no accounting for taste.
It's so simple, but so profound, right?
It really is. It reminds us that there's no one right way to experience desire. What might seem strange or unusual to one person can be deeply meaningful and pleasurable to another.
I love that. So as we wrap up part 2 of this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd want our listeners to remember?
I think, first and foremost, embrace that curiosity, Be open to learning about different perspectives and challenging your own assumptions.
Curiosity is so important. I'm all about it. What else?
Remember that everyone's journey with their sexuality is unique. There's no right or wrong way to explore and express your desires as long as it's done safely and consensually.
So true. Consent, always consent.
And finally, just be kind to yourself and to others. We're all navigating this complex world of desire together, and a little compassion goes a long way.
I love that. Beautifully said. So listeners, stay tuned for part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll explore even more fascinating aspects of unconventional desires. Get ready to have your mind blown. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into unconventional desires.
Wow, this has been one of the most, thought-provoking conversations we've had.
Yeah, no, right? It's been really fascinating to just kind of peel back the layers and look at these often hidden aspects of human sexuality.
Totally. So before we wrap things up, is there anything else we should unpack from all the sources you've gathered? Any burning questions or points we haven't hit yet?
As I was going back through everything, one thing that really jumped out at me was the role of fantasy, in how we explore and understand our desires.
Oh, that's a great point. We touched on it a little bit earlier with Dr. Joyle's research, but I think it deserves more attention. What about fantasy specifically caught your eye? Well, I think we need to recognize that fantasies can serve all sorts of purposes. They can be a safe space, a private space to explore desires that we might not feel comfortable acting out in real life.
Right. It's like a mental playground where you can experiment without any real-world consequences.
Yeah.
But can fantasies also tell us something about ourselves? Can they offer, insights into our deeper desires and needs?
Oh, absolutely. I think paying attention to our fantasies, even those ones that might seem, strange or taboo, can help us understand ourselves better. It's what are the themes that keep popping up? What emotions do they bring up?
It's like those fantasies are trying to tell us something,
Yeah.
sending us messages to decode.
Exactly. And I think that decoding process can be really valuable, even if we never actually act on those fantasies.
So how can someone, explore their fantasies in a healthy and productive way?
Well, journaling can be super helpful. Writing down those fantasies, reflecting on the emotions that come up, and, trying to spot any patterns or themes, it can help you gain a much deeper understanding of what those fantasies might be telling you.
I like that. It's like giving ourselves permission to explore those hidden parts of ourselves without judgment.
Exactly. And, there's no right or wrong way to experience fantasy. What matters is that it feels authentic to you, that it feels fulfilling.
That's so important. And of course, if someone's fantasies are causing them distress or interfering with their daily life, it's always a good idea to seek professional help, from a therapist or counselor.
Absolutely. There's no shame in reaching out for support. It can be really empowering to have that safe space to talk these things through with a trained professional.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by just how diverse and complex human desire really is. It's been, I don't know about you, but it's been an eye-opening journey for me.
Me too, for sure. It really just goes to show that there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to understanding sexuality. What might seem strange to one person can be incredibly meaningful and pleasurable to another.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. So listeners, as you go out into the world, remember to approach this topic with curiosity, with compassion, and with the willingness to challenge your own assumptions. And above all, embrace that beautiful tapestry of human desire in all its amazing forms.
Yeah, and remember, there's always more to learn and explore. Keep those minds open. Keep those conversations going.
And that's our deep dive for today. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, so stay tuned. Until then, happy exploring, everyone.